Most people, when they get paid, open their bank app within the hour. They check the number, feel that brief moment of control, maybe move a little money around, and go on with their day. It's automatic, routine, like checking the weather before leaving the house. For them, the number is just a number. Neutral information, nothing to brace for. But there's another group of people. People who get paid and deliberately don't check, who let days go by, sometimes weeks, with the notifications sitting there on red, who have developed a very specific skill, knowing, roughly, approximately, what must be in there, without ever actually confirming it, who feel something tighten in their chest the moment the app icon appears on the screen, who have closed the app before it fully loaded more times than they could count. If someone asked them why, they probably couldn't give a clean answer. It's not that they don't care, it's almost the opposite. It's that the act of looking carries a weight that's hard to explain to someone who doesn't feel it. Like opening a letter you already know might have bad news. Some part of you decides that as long as you don't read it, the news isn't fully real yet. And if any of that sounds familiar, if you've ever kept that app closed a little longer than you probably should have, here's something nobody has ever actually said to you directly. You're not irresponsible. You're not bad with money. You're not someone who doesn't care. You're someone whose brain learned, at some point, that looking at that number cost something, and it's been trying to protect you ever since. Before we go any further, let's address the story that most people tell about this behavior, because there is a very specific narrative that exists around people who avoid their finances, and chances are you've heard it. Maybe you've even told it to yourself. The story goes like this. They're in denial, they're irresponsible, they'd rather not know because knowing would mean having to face something they're not ready to face. They're burying their head in the sand. And somewhere underneath all of it, they don't really care enough to do better. That story gets repeated in personal finance content, in advice columns, and well-meaning conversations with people who genuinely want to help. And it does something very specific to the people it's about. It takes a behavior that already carries shame, and it adds a layer of character judgment on top of it. It says the reason you do this is because of who you are, because of some flaw in your discipline, your responsibility, your willingness to face reality. And here's the problem with that story. It's not accurate. It's not even close to accurate. The psychology behind financial avoidance has very little to do with laziness, denial, or not caring. What it actually has to do with is something far more human, far more understandable, and far more rooted in how your brain learned to protect you from pain.
Once you understand what's actually happening, the shame starts to look different. Not because the behavior disappears, but because you finally understand where it came from. And that changes everything about how you see yourself in relation to it. To understand why this feels the way it does for you, it helps to first understand how it feels for people who don't experience it. Because the entire financial world was built with those people in mind. For a certain kind of person, checking a bank account is genuinely effortless. They open the app, they see a number, and their nervous system registers it the same way it would register the temperature outside. Useful information, nothing more. Maybe they feel a small satisfaction if it's higher than expected, a small note to adjust if it's lower. But there's no dread in the opening, no weight in the number. It's just data, and data is manageable. Financial culture was designed around this experience. Every budgeting app, every personal finance podcast, every advice column built on the same foundational assumption that information is the missing ingredient, that the reason people struggle financially is because they aren't looking closely enough. Check more often, track every transaction, know your numbers. The logic being that awareness creates control, and control creates stability. And if you just stayed informed, everything else would follow. For the person whose nervous system treats financial data as neutral, that framework works. Looking more often genuinely helps them. The information doesn't cost them anything emotionally, so they can take it in, process it, and act on it without much friction. Awareness, for them, really is the tool it's supposed to be. But that entire framework rests on a condition that it never states out loud. It only works if looking at the number doesn't hurt. It only works if opening the app doesn't trigger something in your chest that has nothing to do with the balance itself. And for a very large number of people, that condition was never met. not because they failed to develop the right habits, but because their relationship with financial information was shaped by experiences that had nothing to do with habits at all. The advice was never wrong for the people it was designed for, it just wasn't designed for everyone. And the ones it wasn't designed for were never told that. They were just handed the same tools and left to wonder why they kept putting them down. So here's what's actually happening when you avoid opening that app. And this is the part that most financial content never gets to, because most financial content isn't really interested in why. It's only interested in what you should do differently. Your brain has made an association, a very specific, very deeply learned one. At some point in your life, the act of checking your financial situation stopped being neutral and became a source of anticipated pain. And once your brain learns that something causes pain, it does what it was built to do. It steers you away from it, quietly, automatically, without asking your permission. You don't decide to avoid the app. The avoidance happens before the decision. That's not weakness. That's your nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems do.
Psychologists call this experiential avoidance. It's one of the most well-documented patterns in human psychology, and it shows up anywhere the brain has learned to associate a specific action with emotional threat. The brain doesn't care whether the threat is real or anticipated. It doesn't stop to evaluate whether the fear is proportionate. It simply registers, "This thing caused pain before. Avoid this thing." And the more times that pattern gets reinforced, the stronger the pull away becomes. For people who avoid financial information, the bank account number stopped being data a long time ago. It became a verdict, a real-time measure of how far behind you are, how close to the edge you're standing, how much of the month is left against how much money probably isn't. Every time you open that app, your nervous system braces for what it might confirm, not because you're catastrophizing, but because at some point, probably more than once, that number delivered news that genuinely hurt. Maybe it was lower than you needed it to be in a moment when you really needed it not to be. Maybe it confirmed something you'd been trying not to know. Maybe it arrived during a period when financial stress was already tied to something larger in your life, something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with safety. And your brain took note, the way brains do, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. It filed the association away. Bank account equals threat. And it started steering you away from the threat the only way it knows how, not by solving the problem, by making the act of looking feel like something to avoid. What makes this particularly hard to untangle is that the avoidance works in the short term. Not looking genuinely reduces the immediate discomfort. The anxiety that would come from seeing the number doesn't come because you didn't see the number. Your nervous system registers that as a success. The strategy gets reinforced, and the next time the app appears on your screen, the pull away is a little stronger than it was before. Not because you're getting worse at managing money, but because your brain is getting better at protecting you from a pain it learned to anticipate. You didn't build this pattern on purpose. Nobody does. It was constructed slowly across experiences you probably didn't register as formative at the time. A stressful month that left a mark, a period when money felt genuinely precarious, a moment when the number in that app meant something much heavier than a number should mean. Your brain connected the dots so you wouldn't have to, and the result is a reflex that feels, from the inside, like avoidance, but is, underneath, something much closer to self-preservation. But here's the part that almost nobody talks about, because most conversations about financial avoidance start and end with the bank account itself, with the habit, with the behavior, as if the avoidance appeared out of nowhere, fully formed, attached to nothing. It didn't. For most people who experience this, the pattern has roots that go much further back than their current balance, further back than any specific financial event in their adult life. Think about what money represented in the environment you grew up in. Not what you were told about money, what you felt around it. For many people, money was never a neutral subject in their household. It was the thing that changed the atmosphere, the topic that made the room go quiet, or loud, or tense in a way that a child couldn't fully understand but could absolutely feel. It was present in arguments that happened in lowered voices after bedtime, in the specific silence that followed a bill arriving, in the way a parent's mood shifted on certain days of the month without explanation. Children in those environments don't learn to treat money as a practical tool. They learn to treat it as a signal, an indicator of whether things are safe or not. And they become very sensitive to that signal very early, before they have any framework for understanding what they're picking up on. What that builds over years is a nervous system that associates financial information with emotional danger. Not intellectually, not consciously, but in the deep, automatic way that early environments shape us before we have the language to describe what's happening. And then that child becomes an adult with their own bank account, their own financial responsibilities, their own app with a number that updates in real time. And the nervous system they developed at 8 years old is still the one responding to it, still reading that number as a signal, still scanning for danger, still reaching for the same protection it learned to reach for when it had no other options. You didn't choose the environment that taught you this, and you didn't choose the nervous system it built, but you've been living with both ever since. There's something important to acknowledge here, though, and this is the part that most validating content quietly skips because it's uncomfortable to say after everything that came before. Avoidance, at a certain point, stops being protection and starts being its own kind of weight, not because of what it says about your character, but because the things we don't look at don't stay still. They move. Sometimes they grow, and the longer the distance between you and that number, the heavier the act of looking becomes. The anxiety doesn't decrease with avoidance. It accumulates. It calcifies around the habit until the habit feels permanent, until looking feels not just uncomfortable, but genuinely impossible. What started as a reasonable response to anticipated pain can, over time, quietly close off parts of your life that have nothing to do with money. Decisions you don't make, conversations you avoid, plans you don't build because building them would require knowing the number first. The protection becomes a boundary you can no longer see past. This isn't a judgment, it's just the honest part of the conversation, the part that says what your brain built made sense once, and it may have quietly outlived its usefulness. So here's what's actually true. You don't avoid your bank account because something is wrong with you. You avoid it because your nervous system learned, in conditions you didn't choose, that financial information carried a weight that wasn't safe to absorb alone. That the number in that app meant more than a number should mean. That looking had consequences that went beyond the balance itself. Nobody taught you to have a neutral relationship with money. Nobody sat you down and explained that a number is just a number, that it doesn't measure your worth, your effort, or your future, that it can go down and come back up, that looking at it, even when it's hard, is survivable. You weren't given that foundation. And then the world handed you the full weight of financial responsibility and assumed you had it. What you built instead was a way of managing, imperfect like every coping mechanism that gets constructed under pressure, but built from something real, from a genuine need to protect yourself in a world that never made money feel safe. That's not irresponsibility. That's not failure. That's a human being doing what human beings do when they're carrying something heavy without the right tools. If you've been carrying shame about this, you can put some of it down today. Not all of it, but the part that tells you you're broken or careless or fundamentally bad at life. That part was never an accurate diagnosis. It was a story built on a behavior without ever asking where the behavior came from. You're not someone who doesn't care about their financial life. You're someone who cares so much that looking at it directly became too heavy to do alone. And that is a very different thing, a much more human thing than the story you've probably been telling yourself for years. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, the next video is going to go even deeper, because it turns out that people who avoid their bank account often share something else, a feeling that no matter how hard they work, no matter how careful they try to be, they're always falling behind. Like the ground keeps shifting just fast enough that catching up becomes impossible. And the psychology behind that feeling is something the financial world has very little interest in explaining. Click the next video. You'll understand why.